So let's start by talking about technology in general. In Silicon Valley here in the US, many companies create software and hardware and web apps that are designed to revolutionize and disrupt industries and with intent to make the world a better place. As we know from recent news, many of these services don't always end up making the world a better place, but the intent behind them is to do so. The same can be said for intent behind technologies in education. And Clay Christensen and the Christensen Institute has written many books about disrupting industries. 5 or 6 years ago, there was Disrupting Class, where he described some of the ways that technology was changing education. Today I'm going to talk about how it's changed and how technology has impacted education by using the acronym WHOM. And WHOM stands for what to know. So we're going to talk about what's important to know, and also how technology changes our ways of learning and how we learn. And finally, technologies provide students and teachers and learners opportunities to express through media. So let's start by talking a little bit about what's important to know. So what's important to know is definitely connected to what we have access to learn about. Of course, right now in the World Wide Web, we have access to almost ubiquitous information, but access to information does not equal knowledge. If that were the case, educators would be out of a job. Everything would be taken care of. Go find the information and then you know it. Of course, there needs to be a lens to understand the information that we encounter, both from a disciplinary perspective as well as a discriminatory perspective. But let's talk about the disciplinary perspective first. Disciplines provide a lens or a schema for understanding the information that we encounter. So a scientist would think about a problem quite differently than a historian who might think about patterns over time, or a mathematician who might look at quantitative data. A scientist might use the scientific method to test things. So I think when I talk about disciplinary knowledge, it's important to understand the content of each discipline, but what's really even more important is to understand the perspective of the professional in that domain and kind of the rules of that profession that have grown over the thousands and thousands of years that they've been developed. So disciplinary knowledge is an important thing when we describe what is important to know. In addition, what's important to know is technology literacy. When I talk about the technology literacy, I mean the mechanics of the hardware, the conventions of software development, computer science, vocabulary, what is binary code, those sort of things. And there's really fun and engaging ways to do that with children now in schools. Here's an example of the Raspberry Pi, which is an inexpensive computer. You can learn the basic components of a computer board. You can connect inputs, and so you begin understanding that technologies and computers need inputs, sensors, or keyboards. And then you can put outputs, like either a monitor or physical things. And through using something like the Raspberry Pi, students begin building that technology literacy. That's important to know. It's also important to know computer science, and there's huge initiatives towards that now. And I think I don't need to go into more detail about why it's important to understand that, but it's really a good line is you either code or you become coded. You need to understand what you're engaging with and encountering with technologies. What's also important to know is applied technology, really integration into subject areas. So for example, that might mean understanding the mechanics of how the software works. You need to create a spreadsheet to be able to solve some complicated mathematics problems. Use a word processor to type and to understand and express yourself through writing. You will probably need to understand manipulating imagery, because much of the imagery you encounter in the world is now manipulated. If you're in science, you want to understand probeware, how you can collect data for scientific studies. And of course, there's the importance to understand how to use technologies appropriately and the ethics of it. Howard will talk about that later. Finally, it's important to know the human skills. These are not disciplinarily based, but they are what we call the 4 C's. Communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. And these have long been the language of progressive education, but it has recently been co-opted by the technology world, saying that, oh, students need to learn to collaborate through working on a Google Doc. Well, I'd argue they probably learn to collaborate better through playing music in a band. Nonetheless, these words have been co-opted by the technology companies, and that's because those 4 C's allow us to bridge the information ubiquity with disciplinary knowledge and the kind of human interaction that can allow us to know. So as we move over from what's important to know, we're going to talk a little bit about how technology has impacted how we learn. And I think the most important way to think about that, or one of the important ways, is through multimedia. And whereas historically you could learn through hearing a lecture or reading a book, in the last 100 years there's been moving image and media, standard 1.0 media, but new media has come on the place soon. So I work at a company called BrainPop, where if you're learning about the solar system, for example, there are 12 different entry points to learning about it. You can watch a movie, you can take a quiz, you can make your own movie, you can play games, you can read. There's all sorts of different ways of engaging with the most important concepts of the solar system, but through various modalities and approaches. So we like to talk about that as discover, play, and create. So I can discover information through watching movies, doing primary sources and readings. I can play with the information through taking quizzes or playing games and activities, and then I can demonstrate my understanding through creating a movie or coding or creating a map, concept map. So that's important about multimedia ways of how we can learn. Indeed, there are also technology-based instruction now, which is all the rage with personalized learning and whatnot. Dreambox is an example of a mathematics curriculum here in the US that's being widely used. Students are posed with questions, they input answers, the service collects data, it serves up a skill-based content based on how a student either correctly or incorrectly answered. And there's really no better, these programs are no better than the algorithm they're based on. And I often like to call them personalized practice over personalized learning. It's also great for intrinsically motivated students. They can go to a place like Khan Academy and go and consume videos and do interactives to begin learning that way, really on their own. It's less designed for within school settings, but outside of school. So again, the intrinsically motivated student has the world is their oyster when it comes to learning. Now, but the important thing for them to understand now is who to trust. What's the point of view? What's the intent? What's the reliability? Are these facts or opinions? They have to have critical reasoning so they can understand the fallacies that may be communicated through information they encounter online. The last way we're going to consider technology's disruption is through giving learners new opportunities to express themselves through media. Here we see a student blogging about their yoga practice, or a group of first grade students making an animated movie about taking care of baby chicks that's viewable for thousands of people on YouTube. The change of scale and audience fundamentally creates motivation for students and audience. So we've described what's important to know, how to learn it, and how opportunities to express yourself through media are all deeply impacted by technology. But we also know that the reality in schools and in learning is very different from the rhetoric. While Silicon Valley wants to make the world a better place, that disruption makes many, many, many new objectives and a real fundamental shift that the education world may not be ready for at this time. It's my professional opinion that it has to do with teacher training. And indeed, the OECD has done research as well, our PISA friends, that say students who use computers moderately may do somewhat better, but students who use computers frequently often do worse, even after accounting for social background and demographics. So what do we do? I think the important element here is to choose your tools wisely when it comes to technologies. Scratch is a learning platform from MIT that addresses the whom. The what to know is done through coding, and the how to learn is done in a playful, passionate, child-centered way. And the opportunities to express yourself through media are fundamentally honored because you create a project within Scratch. However, if we go back to the root of the word whom, it is who, and of course that stands for humans. And what's very, very important at the base of all of this is the teachers. The teachers are still most important. Within technology, we always talk about the software and the hardware, but we need to focus more on the humanware. So whom also has a trick ending because it's really focusing on the people and not necessarily the technology. Thanks. Look forward to chatting with you now.